Welcome, everyone. I'm Elliot Gerson. Welcome to what will be a conversation about the very modest topic of our democracy is in peril and what can we do about it. I think it's fair to say that regardless of any of our own political views, we see growing on a daily basis deep concern about the state of our nation with increasingly hyper-partisan, often poisonous politics, high polarization. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why are we in this situation, and I hope we'll have time, much more importantly, to talk about what we can do about it. This is going to be a bit of a hybrid for those of you familiar with Aspen Ideas Festival kinds of conversations. I've got a very distinguished panel, but I'm actually going to involve two of the other panelists in roles almost as co-moderators. I'm going to start with Michael, and I'll give brief introductions in just a minute, and then engage them in what I hope will be a three, if not four-way conversation, and then open it up all to you. The reason we're doing it this way is that the premise of this conversation is that Michael Sandel's book, The Tyranny of Merit, is really of extraordinary diagnostic value about where we are today, and not just, frankly, in this country, but in much of the world. And for those of you who were in this very room this morning, you could see that I'm not the only one who feels that way. Senator Bennett of Colorado, he actually riffled through his own copy of this book, and you could see underlinings throughout. It resonates incredibly about where we are. And so we're going to talk about that, but then, as I said, hope to talk about what we can do about it. Michael Sandel needs very little introduction. He's a favorite here at Aspen. Of course, he's a professor of government at Harvard. He's arguably one of the leading, if not the leading, political and moral philosophers of our time. In addition to this, his most recent book, which is our focus today, he's written many other important books. He's sort of a definer of justice for a generation, and we're thrilled to have him here. Annie Murphy-Paul could become an Aspen favorite herself very soon, I suspect. A science writer who appears in the nation's leading journals both for generalists and scientists alike. Her latest book is The Flexible Mind, which has received rave reviews. And David Leonhardt, like Michael, is already an Aspen favorite. He's been here many times. He is, of course, a senior writer for the New York Times. He writes the daily newsletter, The Morning, which many of us can't imagine facing a morning without. Former op-ed writer. And arguably, I think, David, we could call you perhaps now the nation's leading explainer of almost everything important.
Thank you, Elliot.
So I will start, as I said, with some very open-ended questions of Michael. So for those of you who haven't read the book, you will understand the basic thesis, and again, there'll be a little bit of redundancy for those who were here this morning. Now, Michael, let us begin. First of all, it's so great to see you outside of a Zoom room. Michael and I have known each other for, embarrassingly, 4 decades. Coincidentally, I hope it's coincidental, the precise 4 decades that he describes as causing the mess that we are in. As I said, we don't have the time to discuss the book in detail, but I'll mention the last time I interviewed Michael was before the book was published. We had, thanks to the McCluskey family here in Aspen in our McCluskey series, a book talk, and I got an advance copy of it. And we discussed that, and even at that time, it was apparent this was really a book for our national, if not our global moment. And apparently quite a few other people thought so too. I don't know if you've noticed this, but there are tens of thousands of people who've watched that interview on YouTube. So I'm sorry to say, Michael, I suspect that there are probably a lot of college students who did not buy your book, but listened to your interview. But for those of you interested in a much more detailed discussion just of the book, you can go to YouTube and find that very easily. Let me say just very briefly that Michael writes, and this is what I think is one of several things that's extraordinary about it, with incredible sympathy to the voters whose deep resentment to elites have led them to embrace populists in this country and around the world. He describes how deepening inequality of income combined with attitudes toward success and also attitudes toward the lack of success have brought us to where we are now. And he talks about what he describes as a toxic mix of hubris from society's winners, and may I say, arguably, many of those in this tent, and resentment from its relative losers, and how that has caused our nation to boil. And let me just note on that last point, sort of a warning, if I will, to our audience, that his book and his thesis is perhaps fair to say a challenge to an Aspen audience, because he says much of our civic troubles are due to the failures of elites, meritocratic elites, credentialed elites, and including mainstream leaders of both the Democratic and Republican parties alike. So, Michael, how did this failure of governing elites provide the populist backlash that led not just to the election of Donald Trump, but to Brexit and our polarized politics? And what does it have to do with this notion of merit?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for that generous introduction, Elliot. And as Elliot says, we go back a long way and have been friends for a very long time. And I want to thank David and Annie for joining us in this discussion. Why is democracy in peril? I think that's why everybody showed up today. Well, here's one answer. Democracy is in peril because the defeated president refused to accept his defeat and incited a mob to make a violent attack on the US Capitol. Democracy is in peril because nearly 2 years after the last election, many Americans and the majority of Republicans continue to believe the lie that Donald Trump told them, that the election was stolen from them. Democracy is in peril because our politics and our social life are polarized and rancorous. We've lost the art, the democratic art of political argument, of reasoning with one another. We've even lost the ability to disagree. That's democracy in peril. And democracy is in peril, finally, on this account, because the defeated president and those who echo his claims are standing by, waiting in the wings, while his successor struggles, some would say flounders, contending with inflation and high gas prices and the war in Ukraine and the pandemic, waiting for their return to power. Now, all of these things, I think, are the case, but they're not the main reason democracy is in peril. They are symptoms of the peril. For the main reason, we have to look back across the last 4 decades, during which time the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do with the growing inequality of income and wealth that the market-driven globalization of the last 4 decades produced. But it's not only that. I think it has also to do with changing attitudes towards success that have accompanied the rising inequality. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success, or as Elliot suggests, our success, is our own doing, the measure of our merit, and that we therefore deserve the full bounty that the market bestows upon us. And by implication, that those who struggle, those who've been left behind, must deserve their fate as well. Now, this way of thinking about success, Elliot referred to it as the hubris, the meritocratic hubris of elites. And it goes hand in hand with a sense of humiliation for those who are told their failure is their fault. These attitudes arise from a seemingly attractive principle, which takes me to your second question, Elliot. The principle of merit, meritocracy. It seems attractive because what it says is insofar as chances are equal, and we know they're not equal, but insofar as they could one day be made equal, the winners deserve their winnings. Now, the problem with this principle is that it has a dark side. And the dark side is that meritocracy, even a perfectly realized meritocracy, is corrosive of the common good because it teaches the successful to inhale too deeply of their success, our success, to forget the luck and good fortune that help us on our way, to forget our indebtedness to those who make our achievements possible. Families, teachers, neighborhood, community, country, the times in which we live. And it leads governing elites to come to the charge against elites, Elliot. It leads governing elites to respond to the inequality and the wage stagnation and the job loss of the age of globalization. It leads governing elites of both parties to make the following response to the inequality. The problem is not in the economy we created. The problem is that you, those who are struggling, need to improve yourselves. You need to go to college. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. But what these elites, and many of us who became accustomed to these slogans, overlooked was the insult implicit in that bracing advice. Because if you didn't go to college, and most Americans don't have a four-year college degree, if you didn't go to college and if you're struggling in the new economy, the implication is your failure is your fault. So it's no wonder that many working people turned against elites, came to mistrust experts, to resent mainstream political leaders of both parties, and embraced the populist backlash and Donald Trump.
So let me ask, before we involve our other guests, that is the diagnosis.
Right.
What are some elements, prescriptive elements? It's taken us 4 decades to get in this mess. What are some of the things we can do? What are the things you celebrate in your book is the dignity of work, for example, that seems to be lost in this mix of things you describe. And maybe there was some hope, and you wrote this just as the pandemic was beginning, or actually before the pandemic. We've all recognized and honored in so many ways with signs and everything else our essential workers.
Right.
But are they actually being rewarded any more today than they were 3 years ago? I don't think so.
Right.
But either around that point about dignity of work, or are there other things we can do? One of the other things you talk about in this book is sort of the financialization of the economy, and you talk about how we over-rely on markets to establish value. Are there things in the tax code, for example? The fact that we tax labor more than we do dividends and investment income.
Right.
But just so we can think about how do we get out of this?
Right. Well, here's a start, and you've given a good suggestive account of some of the possibilities. The dignity of work. One, it seems to me, first we need to change the basic terms of public discourse, to focus less on arming people for meritocratic competition and to focus more on making life better for everyone, who especially those who contribute in various ways to the common good, whatever their academic credentials may be. More than 60% of Americans do not have a 4-year degree. So it's folly to create an economy that makes that the necessary condition of dignified work and a decent life. So what would it mean to renew the dignity of work? Elliot, you mentioned the financialization of the economy. And part of what's happened as inequality has grown is that finance and financial activity occupies a greater and greater share of the economy, of GDP, of corporate profits. More and more rewards go to those engaged in finance, some would say financial speculation and manipulation, in many cases, not all. More rewards go to those engaged in finance than to those engaged in making things that are useful and selling them to their fellow citizens or in producing valuable services. And so not only has this led to economic inequality on a vast scale, it has also disparaged the value of work in the traditional sense. And so the social esteem, the social honor, the recognition that goes to people who work for a living in the ordinary sense of work is diminished. And people sense this. And so it's a crisis, not the inequality, I mean, not only of rewarding financial activities that arguably do not contribute anything like the contribution that the pay suggests to the economy or to the common good. And so it's partly economic, but it's also about the allocation of social honor and recognition and esteem, because you don't get the anger. People can be outraged if they feel they're not being paid fairly. That's an issue of fairness. But if people feel that they're looked down upon, that they're not respected, that their work isn't valued, that goes beyond anger at injustice. That creates a sense of resentment, a sense of humiliation, a sense of grievance. And what Donald Trump was able to appeal to was not a sense that the system was rigged and unfair, but that elites are looking down on us. Elites are looking down on you. That was something he was.
Yeah, I'm going to now get Annie and David in the conversation, but again, for those of you who weren't in this room earlier with Senator Bennett, it's not just people who are making things. It's also, our teachers, for example.
Yes.
Senator Bennett talked about the Colorado Teacher of the Year just down Valley in Glenwood Springs, who said that most of her fellow teachers, and who's more important to our future than teachers,
right,
can't afford to live without having 2 or 3 other jobs. So that's part of it. But Annie, please, I'm going to turn things over to Annie and then David, and then we'll all get involved in the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, so David, Michael, when I read your book, one of the passages that really leapt out at me was one in which you charted the rise of the word smart to describe all kinds of things, from policy to technology. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you see that as problematic. Why wouldn't we want a smart government or smart policy?
Right. Well, it's a great question, and Annie wrote a wonderful article about this. The word smart is a telltale sign about the valorization of meritocratic credentialism. And we take it for granted. It used to be that we used the word smart to describe a person who was clever or something like that. But then in the digital age, we started to use the term smart to describe our tools and our machines, smartphones. And then in politics, especially in the 2000s and 2010s, smart came to be the ultimate term of praise of a policy. Smart regulatory policy. I have a quick litany of some of the uses that Barack Obama made of the smart as the ultimate term of praise. Smart diplomacy, smart foreign policy, smart regulation, smart growth, smart spending cuts, smart investments in education, smart immigration policy. I'll skip down the list. Smart counterterrorism policy, climate smart agriculture, and above all, smart grids. During his presidency, Obama spoke in praise of smart grids or smart grid technologies more than 100 times. I counted them. And overall, he used the adjective smart in describing policies and programs more than 900 times. Now, this is interesting if we're looking for the assumptions that language can reveal. And the assumption here that it reveals, I think, is not only the way we valorize a certain kind of meritocratic credentialist way of thinking about life, but also it reflects a technocratic approach to politics. Because part of the appeal of talking about policies as smart is that we don't have to engage in messy debates about just and unjust, or right or wrong, or good or bad. Smart seems like a value-neutral term of praise that everyone on a nonpartisan, non-ideological, neutral basis can affirm. But this, too, is part of what's hollowed out, I think, our public discourse, because the technocratic bent of neoliberal, credentialist, meritocratic ways of thinking essentially consign policy to experts. They're the smart ones. They're the non-ideological technocrats, and that leaves very little left for democratic citizens. And so I think the empty terms of our public discourse, the moral hollowing out of public discourse, is carried out in part by the embrace of markets, but also, Annie, I would say, by the embrace of this language, this technocratic language of smart, which is a marker of what I call the tyranny of merit.
We'll come back to you, Annie, for another question. David.
Michael, I think you make a really compelling case that the alienation of the American working class, to use a slightly overbroad term, but I assume you don't reject that, has really fueled and in many ways created a crisis of democracy, right? That's what's behind this crisis.
Yes.
And I think you also make a compelling case that the turn toward market-dominant economics has helped, is one of the main reasons why living standards have stagnated for the masses of people. And I think a lot of progressives hear that and say, yes, absolutely, and they favor many of the policies that would naturally stem from that. It also seems to me there are parts of your argument that are a little more uncomfortable for progressives, and I just want to spend a moment on them.
Please.
I think that you talk about people feeling alienated and not listened to in this country. And when you look at polling, it's clear that Americans without a college degree are more conservative on many social issues than this room is, right? They are much more religious. In your book, you embrace the word patriotism, but much of the left does not, right?
Yes.
We're renaming schools that were named for Abraham Lincoln, right? Working class people are more likely to favor abortion restrictions connected to religion. And I should note, this is not just white working class people, this is working class people across races. Working class people are often in favor of immigration restrictions, again, across races. Working class people have been more in favor of restarting life after COVID. There's a fascinating poll about why Latinos in Texas swung to the right in 2020. Many liked Donald Trump's approach to COVID. I personally did not, but I understand why people would see that. And so if democracy is in fact in crisis, does the progressive community have some responsibility, or would it be tactically wise, strategically wise, to listen to working class people more, not only on the economic issues, which would argue for moving more to the left, but on some of the social issues, which might argue for a more moderate policy than many college graduates today would favor? And are working class people right to feel like many college graduates, many elites, have taken positions we hold, religious positions, positions on hot button issues, and deemed them ignorant or hateful, rather than legitimate positions that someone might have because they hold different values than someone else?
Yes. Yes to both questions. So I think that that's a very astute reading, and what it suggests is that if we're to take seriously the search for a politics of the common good that is less polarized and less rancorous, and that engages in a morally more robust kind of public discourse than the kind to which we've become accustomed, progressives have to do a better job of listening. I think everybody has to do a better job of listening. Part of what we've lost in the public culture, and progressives are certainly among those who have shared in this loss, this deficiency, is the ability to listen. Our arguments are hollow, our public discourse is hollow, in part because we aren't good at listening, and so much of the civic infrastructure, and social media is a part of this, reinforces our bad habits, our inability to listen and to engage and to consider where other people are coming from rather than labeling them in advance as ignorant. You gave a list of very telling and challenging examples, but to take the example of climate change, and we saw this also in the pandemic. I think we can learn something from the way the pandemic was discussed for climate change. What elites, and especially progressive elites, tended to say about the pandemic and what choices should be made is the same thing that many of us say with regard to climate change. Follow the science. We just want to follow the science. That's how we decide whether and when to close schools and when to open schools during a pandemic. Follow the science. Remediating climate change. How should we do it? Follow the science. We believe in science. I believe in science. This has become a slogan, a political slogan that wins applause.
Yard signs.
Yes. But this, I think, is a deeply destructive mode of political persuasion. First of all, it doesn't persuade anyone who doesn't already share the underlying view about whether to open or close the schools during a pandemic. It doesn't persuade anybody who isn't already on board with strong efforts to remediate climate change. To the contrary, it sends the same kind of insult as the rhetoric of rising sends an insult. Because what it says, first of all, we know it's not true. Because although scientific judgments and findings and data matter a lot and should in deciding when to close schools and when to open schools, or how to reconfigure the economy to deal with climate change, science alone can't make those judgments for us. These are political judgments. These are practical judgments. These are judgments that involve weighing competing values and risks. Science can inform those judgments, but these are fundamentally moral and political judgments. So when we say to those who don't share our concern for remediating climate change or dealing with the pandemic, follow the science, the insult we're sending is, we know we're scientifically literate. You don't. You have to inform yourself, and then you will, like us, follow the science. And so I think we should drop that. It's not a way of either winning friends or influencing people, or reviving the art of democratic listening.
Annie, back to you.
Yeah, Michael, I find myself wondering if you think that it's the phenomenon of meritocracy itself that is the problem, or simply the narrow slice of human capacities and abilities that the meritocracy, as it's now constructed, values and rewards. This may sound like a whimsical question, but what if we were able to engineer a meritocracy that valued and rewarded kindness or integrity or morality? Would that be a meritocracy we could get behind?
Well, and it's not all that fanciful, because Plato had that idea. Plato didn't talk about the rhetoric of rising. He didn't say what you earn will depend on what you learn. But he had a broader conception of merit, and he believed that the meritorious should rule, the philosopher king. That's the ultimate meritocracy. But for him, and this goes to your point, Annie, about too narrow a conception of merit, we define merit mainly in terms of academic credentials. The metrics of merit really are two: SAT scores and money. How high are your test scores, and how much money do you make? These are the two, in practice, measures of merit that inform our practice of meritocracy. And both of these are spurious measures, even of intellectual merit, never mind merit more broadly conceived. Now, Plato wasn't so much concerned with merit as kindness, but he did believe in merit as virtue, and in terms of governing, civic virtue. Now, if we could somehow design a meritocracy where those who landed on top were the most deserving in the sense of being the most virtuous, well, I'd have a harder time arguing against that. Let's put it that way. That would have at least a stronger claim. But where the measure of merit is achieving high scores on standardized tests or making a lot of money, that's a woefully inadequate measure even of merit, understood as intellectual merit. Yeah.
David.
Given the acute threat to democracy in this country, it seems to me that the kind of swing voters or swing players are going to be Republicans. They're going to be people like the Secretary of State in Georgia who said no to Donald Trump. They're going to be people like the Supreme Court justices who, whatever else you think of them this week, said no to Donald Trump. What do you think are the most effective arguments for winning over Republicans who are open to the notion that their party should be willing to accept losses the way it has for decades and decades and decades? What are, to you, the most effective arguments for protecting democracy in this time of extreme peril?
Well, I think we should begin, Democrats and Republicans, of the mainstream kind who have been governing prior to Trump's blowing up that settlement, need to begin, I think any persuasive political appeal should begin by acknowledging their own failure. They, both Democrats and Republicans, from Reagan to Clinton, to including the Bushes, up through Obama, all accepted basically the economic and political project of neoliberal globalization. National borders shouldn't matter. We should force countries to accept unfettered flows of capital across borders. We should outsource jobs to low-wage countries. It will be more efficient. It will lead to lower consumer prices. It will even lead China, once admitted to the WTO, eventually to respect human rights and move toward democracy. You remember, we were told all of this, and including in sessions, in Aspen and in Davos, but on the campaign trail. In fact, it was such an article of faith that it became rather dull and predictable, this account, the Washington Consensus account of an economy. So I think both parties should begin, the mainstream figures who wanted to protect democracy, Democrats and Republicans, should begin to acknowledge that we got it wrong in pretty grievous ways. And the people who now resent us and who now are engaged in a backlash against elites have a point. It's not just a kind of mindless lashing out. Now, there is racism involved, to be sure, in Trump's appeals, and sexism and misogyny and xenophobia, that's for sure. But to see only that dimension of Trump's appeal to 74 million people is not only politically unrealistic, but it's also an exercise in complacence. It lets these elites, it lets us off the hook for having created the conditions that paved the way to Trump. So that gesture, I think, it's important not to underestimate the importance of that acknowledgement. And around the edges, now the Republican Party, there are a few figures in the Republican Party who are beginning to say, we could become the party of working people. And let's figure out how. And they've begun to develop. And on the Democratic side, the working class, those without a college education, used to vote reliably Democratic. And those with a college education, back in 1960, John F. Kennedy lost college-educated voters 2-1 and won the presidency because non-college educated voters voted for him. In 2020, Joe Biden won easily among college-educated voters, and Donald Trump won comfortably among non-college educated voters. And among white non-college educated voters, he won almost 2-1. So it's almost exactly reversed. So both parties need to take account of it.
There's a great historical echo, and it's brief, I promise, but we all remember the Dewey beats Truman headline, right? Why did the polls show Dewey so far ahead of Truman? Some of it was that Truman launched a comeback, but some of it was that polls then, as now, missed working class voters.
Yeah.
So they all thought Dewey was going to win because they weren't surveying enough working class voters. Working class voters voted for Harry Truman, and they voted for Donald Trump.
Michael, let me ask you one quick question before we turn.
Yeah.
You've talked so often about college educated, and you talked earlier about luck. For those of you who haven't read the book, one of the remarkable things is the focus on and you will all remember the scandal with very wealthy parents, now some in jail, for defrauding universities to get their children into universities. And these are people who could have provided their children with trust funds for great success and or at least affluence for the rest of their life, but they thought that credential was incredibly important. Back to prescriptions, and I'm just curious to know what's happened the last 2 years. I suspect I know the answer. He makes a suggestion in the book about Harvard, which gets zillions of applicants, that what they should do is eliminate the relatively small number who are just not qualified and then admit everyone by lottery. I assume that has not gone over very well.
It hasn't happened yet. No, they didn't take.
Which would do something about showing the significance of luck, and it might begin to de-emphasize some of this credentialism that has carried us so far. Okay, I promised here. So first in the front row, quick question. Let's bring the microphone because we're taping this for others, so you can tell people to tune in 24 hours when it will be on our website.
So, Michael, you've talked a lot about what's wrong with American democracy this morning and this afternoon, but the title of our session is, what can we do about it?
Yeah.
So can you give me or the audience one or two simple policy ideas that might be nonpartisan that people can get behind? Because hearing all about this is exactly why most Americans have problems with elites, because what's a simple solution to address a part of the issue.
Right. Not a simple solution and not a bipartisan solution. But here are some examples. Elliot mentioned a few. We should ask why should we tax working people earnings from labor at a higher rate than earnings from capital and dividends and capital gains? What does that say about the way we value work? Number one. Number two, get rid of the payroll tax or a portion of it, which is a tax on labor, and substitute the revenues through a financial transactions tax as a way of saying we really do honor work and the market gets it wrong the way it allocates. I would also, we should also debate how to limit the flight of capital to low-wage countries and find ways to direct capital to productive rather than speculative purposes, because vast proportion of financial activity is directed to essentially bets on already existing assets rather than investing in new productive activity, whether factories or employees or education. And that, I mean, getting rid of stock buybacks would be one way of doing that. People will disagree about how to achieve these things. But here, these would be 3 or 4. More broadly, we need to change the terms of political debate along the lines that we've been discussing.
Right here, microphone in the third row in the middle.
Thanks. Thanks. Can you hear me? Similar but follow-up question, kind of alluding to what David was asking you. We seem to be in a crisis right now, but what you're talking about has had roots, as you're saying, for generations.
Yeah.
In language, in policy,
Yeah.
in division, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Is this something that it's going to take a generation, like give up on this generation, let's teach the next generation how to go back to democracy? Is this going to take a generation to flip back to calm, balanced, civil discourse, et cetera? Or is there something we can do with the voting public now to sway it to really come back to center?
Thank you. It might take a generation, but I hope not. There are other measures that have to do with rebuilding the civic infrastructure of a shared democratic life. One of the most corrosive effects of the inequalities that we've seen, apart from the unfairness to individuals, is the destruction of public places and common spaces that bring people together, class-mixing institutions, that bring people together across differences of race and class and ethnicity and background, so that we encounter one another in the course of our everyday lives. Now, this could be perhaps a more bipartisan proposal than some of the other harder tax measures. We'd have to see. But to rebuild public institutions within civil society, whether public parks, public schools, public transportation, cultural centers, community centers, so that they can be used by rich and poor alike, and we actually encounter one another in shared democratic spaces. So that would be perhaps more bipartisan. It would require some investments, but it would also require a deliberate commitment to repair the civic life. It would also require changing the way the media works, creating alternatives to the shouting media of cable television and social media, to try to create alternative, maybe not-for-profit driven sources of media.
We're running out of time, and I am trying to see the entire audience, but let's just go. There are 2 questions on this aisle, and if you could each ask them quickly, and we'll allow, I hope, Michael to make some kind of enveloping final remark.
Hi, I really appreciate all your comments. My biggest worry in what you're saying, though, is you're saying that you want to move away from a meritocracy, or at least it feels like that, because the meritocracy is not real. However, the only alternative for the working class right now is a white nationalist republic. So can you think of a different way of framing it so that it doesn't seem like we're pushing the meritocracy away, something that is a positive way of framing it for the white working class?
And there was one other question this aisle, I think. We can have both of them.
Hi, my question is similar to that. A politician shows up with a snowball and says, this proves that global warming is not happening. Or someone says, let's imbibe disinfectant and that's going to cure COVID.
Right.
What's the response to that? That would be, to those many for whom this is a dispositive argument.
Right. Well, it would take a while. It would take a while, but the first step goes to a suggestion that David made, which is we have to start listening. And when we listen to those who we describe as climate change deniers, I don't mean the politicians, but I mean the citizens, the American citizens. We have to ask ourselves, is it because they're ignorant of science? Or is it because they don't trust the government or elites to reconfigure the economy in a quite substantial way, in a way that would serve everybody's interests? And I think that the real problem, the impasse on climate change, it's not scientific illiteracy or ignorance. It's about trust. And the reason it's a longer engagement involving listening is that we have to realize that the mistrust of experts, whether during the pandemic or with climate change, reflects the justified mistrust of economic experts who assured us that globalization would help everyone. And that means rebuilding trust, and that takes a while. That might take a generation or two. But it's important to see it as a political question, not as a scientific or literacy question. If you want me to...
No, that's all right. Take another...
Well, all right.
We'd like to stay all afternoon.
All right, well, we can't. So here's... And this, I mean, it's connected to the matter of trust. It's hard to trust one another. And it's hard to listen to one another if we don't really encounter one another very much, which goes to this question about public places and common spaces. And so this might be one concrete, tangible place to start. And here is a vivid expression of what that might look like and what it sometimes has looked like in the past. The idea of meritocracy, and the questioner here wanted to know, well, what's the alternative? What's the alternative to meritocracy? It goes back, in many ways we associate it with the American dream of rising. Isn't the rhetoric of rising simply a reassertion of the traditional American dream? And isn't meritocracy an expression of that?
But the problem is the dream now works better in Canada, most of Western Europe, and China.
Well, as far as mobility, that's true. But I went back and looked at the origin of the phrase, the American dream. It was in the 1930s. In a book, nobody remembers the book, but except probably Walter Isaacson, by James Truslow Adams. And the book was called The Epic of America. But what stuck was this phrase, the American dream. And the American dream did have something to do with mobility and the chance to work hard and to enjoy the fruits of your efforts. But that wasn't all. Here's what he said. It wasn't only about moving up the American dream. It was about achieving what I would describe as a broad democratic equality of condition. That doesn't mean that everyone has to have the same amount of income and wealth, but it does require that there be a shared common life with public provisions and public services that enable people in the experience of their everyday lives to remember that they share a way of life as democratic citizens. And James Drusilla Adams offered an example of his own. The Library of Congress, the reading room. Can I just read this
Yeah,
short
please.
passage? He said, as one looks down on the general reading room, which alone contains 10,000 volumes, which may be read without even the asking, one sees the seats filled with silent readers, old and young, rich and poor, black and white, the executive and the laborer, the general and the private, the noted scholar and the schoolboy, all reading at their own library provided by their own democracy. Adams considered this vignette to be the perfect working out in a concrete example of the American dream. The means provided by the resources of the people themselves, and a public intelligent enough to use them. And he concluded by saying, if this example could be carried out in all departments of our national life, the American dream would become an abiding reality. I think he had a point.
I think that's a wonderful way to end. Michael, David, and